Okay, I'm going to do this for myself because I'm having trouble. This is section 2 of the series of ethics lectures for people who are in the program for licensed ministry in the United Methodist Church in the Rio, Texas conference. So if you're just coming in and you don't know what this is for, you need to go back and look at the first video, scroll up, whatever. Hopefully I'll put these on in the right order. You can see there why it is you can hear me explain why I'm not using Zoom, why I'm using this. Okay, section 2. All right, start my timer. So, here are some of the particular, my allergies. Here are some of the particular reasons why, if you're in the United Methodist Church, that a version of conundrum, trolley problem ethics combined with a Miss Manners, Dear Abby form of ethics, combined with ethics as personal temptation. Here's some of the reasons why, for many United Methodists, those versions of doing ethics might be tempting because of the system that is the United Methodist Church in the United States. And here I'm going to be making some broad generalizations that do not apply to everyone who's in this particular training program. I know that I'm making generalizations, but I'm going to risk doing so because I only have about an hour to teach. So within the United Methodist Church, many of us, and I am an elder in the United Methodist Church, I'm a cradle United Methodist. My dad is a retired Methodist minister. My mom is a retired public school teacher. I grew up in a parsonage, meaning the pastor's home, all over West Texas mostly. And so I've been a part of the Methodist Church all my life, and I've taught and learned from many, many Methodist ministers. And I think it's fair to say that for many ministers who are still in the United Methodist Church, many of us prefer to go along to get along most of the time. We prefer to be liked. We prefer to be a part of a family-like community that is mostly copacetic, where people mostly get along with one another. That may be true of other Protestant denominations, but it's, in my experience, often been the case when I've been in a teaching situation with mostly United Methodists, is going into really difficult systemic problems related to anything pertaining to the military, pertaining to school systems, funding for the post office, anything that is a flashpoint and really important for people's lives. Many times Methodists would prefer to go to the trolley problem and talk about what we would do in the hypothetical scenario that we're driving a trolley and have to decide who gets run over. Because that's easier, because we're never going to be behind a trolley trying to decide who gets. So I think that part of the challenge of being a United Methodist and really being ethical is that it can't be a side hustle, it can't be a trolley problem, and we have to name some of the challenges we face as United Methodists, given what is often a culture of going along to get along, so that we don't have to talk about the systemic, big, sometimes out of our control problems in our region, in our small town, in our city, I grew up in West Texas. One of the things that my dad used to, he still says this sometimes, is that when you start approaching politics, it's in a family gathering or a church gathering, it's always a good idea to say, "How about them Cowboys?" Now, I want to be clear. Side note: my dad did deal with a whole lot of conflict when he was serving in the ministry and serving also as a district superintendent. But it is also the case that for many Methodists, we try not to talk about really difficult questions going on in our own communities, And that is related, I believe, to the politics of the hierarchy within the United Methodist Church. So, the United Methodist Church, and if you don't already know this, and you're United Methodist and you're in this program, I promise this is true. The United Methodist Church has a very hierarchical system. So our Episcopal system is more hierarchical than the Episcopal, meaning the Episcopal Church in the United States. The Methodist system is more hierarchical than the Episcopal Church's Episcopal system, meaning that we have a very clear structure. Now, I want to also note that bishops in the United States are often will find themselves accountable to other regional leaders who may or may not be Methodist, who have a lot of money. So I don't want to suggest that the buck stops with the bishop, because bishops are often contending with a whole other set of power dynamics going on in their own region. Having said that, I don't want to get the bishop system completely off the hook by saying that bishops are also accountable to other people who have even more power and lots more money, for sure. Lots more power and lots more money than they do. I want to note that about 25 years ago, maybe it was about 20 years ago, something that became clear to some of us who were looking at the United Methodist system, what became clear to some of us is that bishops were competing with one another, and this is, I didn't come up with this, but I do not have permission to say who came up with this, but it was somebody with knowledge to know, not a member of my family, and actually not a member of the Rio, Texas, or the Southwest Texas Conference from before. But this person knew and said that bishops were talking about congregations and numbers in those congregations like boys with trading cards. Oh, boys with baseball cards. There we go. I never had baseball cards growing up. This person did. So boys with baseball cards. So bishops would compare notes about who was gaining members, who was losing members, which annual conferences were on the uptick during a narrative of decline, where so much of mainstream media, if they were paying attention to mainline Protestantism at all, were talking about the decline of mainline Protestantism. And bishops, not all of them, but many of them, were in a kind of competition to prove that their conference was gaining in members. And just like a fish rots from the head, to mix lots of metaphors here, just like a fish rots from the head, that way of thinking about butts in a pew, that way of thinking about actual human beings in a congregation, it rotted down, and ministers were finding themselves what I call being dashboarded, where they had to and it actually, when I actually found out this actually looks like a dashboard, in class while I was teaching, and I found out that a bishop I really love, not in the Rio, Texas Conference, I won't name who this was, but I thought he'd know better, and somebody told me that he was even doing this dashboarding where they specifically, it looks like an old-fashioned dashboard. It wasn't even aesthetically appropriate. It didn't even meet the Miss Manners version of ethics. But So you were supposed to do a tally of how many confirmations, how many baptisms, how many butts in a pew. And part of what that did was I mean, and this goes way back, and somebody's going to tell me, yes, in the Bible, there are numbers of who converted how many people. Yes, I know that. But this way of thinking that has been a problem at other times in Western Christianity is what I call actuarial, where it becomes a kind of culture of counting, it is a culture of literally counting. And often then you would have a scenario where you were counting people according to who counted. So let's say you had 5 kiddos in your confirmation class, and 2 of them discerned that they were prepared to answer, yes, I do, I will, and the other 3 didn't, then the other 3 could feel like failures, and you were to kind of reckon in this actuarial way of thinking that you had done something wrong. I heard this, I'm not making this up, I heard this from actual ministers 15 years ago when they were dealing with this dynamic, this actuarial way of thinking that was involved with this baseball card game going on among bishops. So within the United Methodist Church, we have in general, not everywhere, but we have a sense that it's important to be polite. It's important not to rock the boat. It's important to not cause conflict by naming things in even your own region or your own town that are contentious. And there has been a disincentive to deal with difficult problems in your own town, in your own congregation, because you're supposed to keep people happy enough that they continue to want to be in your pews so that you can give an accounting, actuarial style of how you have spent your time. All right, so yeah, that's a problem, and I'm just going to name that is a problem that the United Methodists have within our hierarchical system that also goes along with a culture of being polite. And I'm not trying to encourage people to be rude. Please don't be rude just for the sake of being rude. I trust you won't. There are other problems that beset congregational ministers. So here are some. There's so many, but some of the struggles that can lead you to want to think of ethics as a side hustle is that you may be dispositionally similar. I've got this problem myself. I want to be in a family system where people are congenial to one another, and I want to be at least the good big sister in that family system. And I've heard from many ministers over the years that it's really important to notice the ways that you go into a community of people, a configuration of human beings, with your own sense of need to be somehow a part of that family that is comfortable for you. And so that is one temptation, to go to ethics as a side hustle or ethics as a trolley problem, because dealing with the ethics of a family system in a congregation is really hard. And I'm going to talk about ways to get the advice you need within a congregational system in a bit. But I just wanted to name that is one of the ways that ethics can become something rarefied that a specialist helps you with in particular times of conundrum. No, ethics is a way of consolidating help, consolidating a team in solidarity with other professional people, with other ministers, with other people to whom you're accountable, who can help you think about your ministry and your vocation. All right. Oh, and here's an obvious one, but maybe it bears noting that if what you're trying to think about is how not to run over someone with a trolley, you don't have to name as an ethical conundrum thinking of other people in terms of how much they can give, in terms of money. And I've watched actual lay people in actual meetings remind the minister how much they're giving, to say that their vote should matter more because they give more in a congregation. I remember hearing this when I was not even sure I was called to ministry yet, long time ago, in a suburb or a section of the Metroplex. I want to be careful not to call out any particular congregation, but we had a sign out front that had the name of the church and no indication as to what time worship was. So this was a United Methodist church. No indication for the time of worship. And I was serving at this church for a summer job, and God was chasing me in my vocation, and I ended up loving working in that church. But I went to the soon-to-be retired minister of that church, and here with my 19, 20-year-old self, I said, why don't we have the time of the worship service on the, I'm laughing now, I was not laughing then. We don't have the time of the worship service. And he looked at me and he said, yeah, why don't you come to the next board meeting and ask them? I said, well, of course I will. I mean, I'm happy to. So I came to the meeting and I just presented what I thought was obvious. It would be really helpful for people to know, because, you know, if people walk by the church or drive by the church, and the chair of the board said, if we do that, the wrong people might come. I was like, the wrong people? You're not allowed to think that way and be Christian. But everybody on the board was kind of like, well, you know, it's true. And it turned out later I learned that there were people in leadership in that church who were calling the shots, in part because they were keeping the roof on the church and making sure that the roof was repaired enough that water wasn't dropping on parishioners' heads. But yeah, the wrong people might come. I'm grateful to God that I went into ministry, even though that was one of my very first experiences as a person in ministry in a church. Okay, on that note, I think probably, let me look. I'm now almost at my limit for yep. So I'm going to stop this and do my third section next. All right, so this is the end of section 2.